Hey everyone, my name's Derek and I just want to thank you so much for being here with me today on my new journey creating my new channel called the Mandrake Mechanism. Here in the channel, we're going to be diving in really deep to the banking system and just how it's run and the scam and Ponzi scheme that it really is. We're going to be looking at the mechanisms that they use to kind of create this illusion that they pull over our eyes. We're going to look at the fractional reserve banking part of it, we're going to look at the central bank part of it, and we're going to look at the US dollar world reserve currency status / petrodollar. Another huge aspect of the channel is going to be talking about how they've really fooled all of us into using something called the currency rather than real hard honest money, and how this is at the real root cause of all of our economical hardships. We're going to take a look behind the curtain at The Wizard, and I quote The Wizard of Oz, one of my favorite books, and it's actually ironically about banking. We'll get into that another later day. But by looking at how they pull these mechanisms and stuff behind the scenes, we're really going to look and learn how we can make our exit side left, or our left side exit, sorry, off stage and really kind of break away from this. We're going to talk about that hard money being gold and silver and what it really means to have them in a system and how it keeps your system honest. Now you may be asking, why do I need to know this? Why is this important? And to really break it down, I'll use a quote from Mike Maloney, one of my favorite economists. He's actually the author of Guide to Investing in Gold and Silver, one of the most highly published books on this topic. He's the creator of goldsilver.com. By the way, just a shout out to him. Obviously, his new channel first post. I'm not getting anything from him, but he's a really great individual to learn from. And here's a direct quote from him. The quality of a society is directly proportional to the quality of its money. Stable money leads to stable prices, which leads to a stable society, whereas debasement of a currency leads to the demise of empires. So this is why it's so important to know about all of this, because if you do know about it, there is a solution out there that you can move your assets into to protect yourself, get into a defensive mode, and hopefully really at the end of the day prosper and take advantage, because there's never a destruction of money. It's just like energy, like electrical energy is an example. You can't create or destroy it. You only just change its shape or form. So before we jump right into it, I'm just going to break down the channel name and the origins of the channel name. So it is Mandrake Mechanism. It's pulled from my favorite economical book of all time for me personally, The Creature from Jekyll Island, which was written by Edward G. Griffin. So the first part, and both these parts are pulled right from chapter 10, which is even labeled the Mandrake Mechanism. So the first part, Mandrake, comes from, quote, in the 1940s, there was a comic strip character called Mandrake the Magician. His specialty was creating things out of nothing and, when appropriate, to make them disappear back into the same void. It is fitting, therefore, that the process to be described in his honor. The second part, the mechanism aspect, is pulled from the very first little chunk in chapter 10 there. Quote, the method by which the Federal Reserve creates currency out of nothing, the concept of usury as the payment of interest on pretended loans, the true cause of the hidden tax called inflation, the way in which the Fed creates boom-bust cycles. So that's why I chose this term. It's in large part to pay homage to my favorite book and my favorite author on this topic. But in second part too, I think it really fits what I was after and what I really want to do as far as break down the illusion of this system. So with that, kudos. Thank you so much, Edward Griffin. Even hope to have you on the channel one day. So in this episode, we're going to kick things off going over and track just how the illusion was set up from the very beginning to be an inclusive club that 99.9% of us are never meant to be in. And we're really going to track it from the beginning to the modern day. We're going to be going over what money is, where it came from, and how it got completely manipulated. If you like the sounds of that, please like, share, subscribe, help me get this out there, help me grow the channel. I would really appreciate that. You can also follow me on Twitter. My handle is @MandrakeMech. I'll put a description of that in the video below. And with that, let's start the video. Okay, so why are we going to start by looking back? Well, in the famous great words of Winston Churchill, the farther backward you can look, the farther forward you are likely to see. And when we look back to the very beginning, your true wealth was your time and your freedom. Money was just a tool for trading your time, a container to store your economical energy until it was ready to be deployed. So when we talk about tool, what was that tool? Well, from the very beginning of recorded history, we'll say Mesopotamia, that tool has been gold, and it's always been gold up until just very recent history. And we're going to take a quote from James Rickards' book, The New Case for Gold. It does a great job of explaining why gold has been used. So gold is the only element that has all the requisite physical characteristics: scarcity, malleability, inertness, durability, and uniformity, to serve as the reliable and practical and physical store of value. And you can see here, here's another little clip from goldsilver.com. Money is a medium exchange, unit of account, portable, durable, divisible, fungible, which just means interchangeable, and a store of value, which this is just adding on to James Rickards' awesome definition as well. So that's why gold has always been used. So in the beginning, once established as the best form of money, it needed to be secured in a safe place. It was inconvenient to travel and risk having your whole net wealth stolen, so it would be placed in vaults, which were run by blacksmiths at the time, as they had the best vaults of the day. The blacksmiths would keep the metals and issue receipts that could be redeemable at another trusted blacksmith's vault. But this is where the con really begins and takes shape. Once the blacksmiths had possession of the gold for a period of time, they noticed that people only ever came back to redeem a fraction of the gold they had. This is what gave birth to the fractional reserve banking. And the Smiths started lending way more paper than they had gold on hand, and this is what continues to be practiced to this very day. So that's it. That's fractional reserve banking in a nutshell. That really gives an awesome explanation of how it started, and really it's no different today. Instead of using gold and silver in these vaults, they're just using paper and digital inputs into a computer, and they're lending way more than they have. Oftentimes it's supposed to be 10%, sometimes it's 3%, sometimes it's 0% as far as what they have as reserves backing everything that they're lending out. So switching gears to the next topic, we're going to break down central banks and a brief history of their origin. And to do that, there's no better place to go than Mike Maloney's YouTube channel, Gold and Silver, where he has a 10-part series called The Hidden Secrets of Money. In part 4, I'm going to take a small clip where it breaks down the Federal Reserve, which is the United States central bank. So all the principles and applications that are described in this video regarding the Federal Reserve, you can just take that concept and you can apply it to the Bank of Canada, the Bank of England, and all other central banks around the world. So that being said, and no further ado, I'm going to pass it off to the video.
To spend more than its income. This is called deficit spending. To pay for that deficit spending, the Treasury borrows currency by issuing a bond. So what's a bond? If you think about it, a bond is really nothing but a glorified IOU. It's a pretty piece of paper with numbers printed on it that says, loan me $1 trillion today, and I promise over a 10-year period I'm going to pay you back that $1 trillion plus interest. But what you need to understand is that Treasury bonds are our national debt. These glorified IOUs are to be paid back by you and I and our descendants through future taxation. Therefore, when the government issues a bond, it steals prosperity out of the future so that it can spend it today. The Treasury then holds a bond auction, and the world's largest banks show up and compete to buy part of our national debt and make a profit on it by earning interest. You'll notice that as we move through this process, the big banks are there, taking a cut every step of the way. This isn't by chance, as you'll see shortly. Then, through a shell game called open market operations, the banks get to sell some of those bonds to the Federal Reserve at a profit. To pay for the bonds, the Federal Reserve opens up its big old checkbook and writes bad, bogus, counterfeit checks that should bounce because they're drawn on an account that always has a zero balance. There isn't one penny in there. To quote from the Boston Federal Reserve, when you or I write a check, there must be sufficient funds in our account to cover that check. But when the Federal Reserve writes a check, there is no bank deposit on which that check is drawn. When the Federal Reserve writes a check, it is creating money. The Fed then hands those checks to the banks, and at this point, currency springs into existence. The banks then take that currency and buy more bonds at the next Treasury auction. But what is a check? A check is also an IOU. When you write a check, you're making a note that says, here's my IOU for cash. All you have to do is go to the bank and pick it up. Now, it's very, very important that you understand this process because we're going to come back later and show you the devastating effect this has on you. The Treasury issues IOUs, bonds. The banks then buy those IOUs with currency. The Federal Reserve then writes IOUs, checks, and hands them to the banks in exchange for the Treasury's IOUs, the bonds. And currency is created. So what's really happening is the Federal Reserve and the Treasury are just swapping IOUs, using the banks as middlemen, and abracadabra, presto, currency magically springs into existence. This process repeats and repeats over and over again, enriching the banks and indebting the public by raising the national debt. The end result is that there's a buildup of bonds at the Federal Reserve and currency at the Treasury. This process is also where all paper currency comes from. The Federal Reserve and the government mistakenly call it base money because they didn't watch episode 1 of this series and they don't know the difference between money and currency.
So that's it. That's a really brief description. I hope you enjoyed it of the Federal Reserve, which is the United States Central Bank, and it just shows you the shell game that happens between the United States Treasury and the Federal Reserve, just passing IOUs back and forth with the banks as the middlemen in between getting their cut. So like I said, if you really enjoyed that video, I highly recommend go check out the rest of them. So we're going to use a couple other little clips and quotes from history to kind of help us understand again the game and what it is when you're talking about banks. So we're going to pull this one from Aristotle, which he said, money being naturally barren to make it breed money is preposterous and a perversion from the end of its institution, which was only ever to serve the purpose of exchange and not of increase. Men called bankers we shall hate, for they enrich themselves while doing nothing. The next quote we're going to look at, and I know it's a bit of a longer one, it's from Thomas Jefferson. And when you really look back at central bank quotes, this one gets pulled up a lot because it does such a great job of explaining what they are. So he said, the central bank is an institution of the most deadly hostility existing against the principles and the form of our Constitution. I believe that banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies. Already they have raised up a moneyed aristocracy that has set the government at defiance. The issuing power should be taken from the banks and restored to the people to whom it properly belongs. If the American people ever allow the banks to control the issuance of their currency, first by inflation and then by deflation, the banks and corporations that grow up around them will deprive the people of their property until their children will wake up homeless on the continent their fathers occupied. So again, I know it's long, but that does such a great job. If you just take that, I know it was written a couple hundred years ago, but it might as well be written yesterday. This perfectly describes the environment that we're in. So we're going to start now with the brief history of central banks, the first of which was the Bank of England, which was created in 1694. It was and is still privately owned, and its purpose was to lend to the king with interest to which the taxpayer was on the hook. And we're going to take a quote from a gentleman called William Patterson, who had a hand in its creation. He said, "The bank hath the benefit of interest on all monies which it creates out of nothing." So you can just see how over and over and over again that you can pull quotes from these individuals that were either running these institutions or created these institutions. They just tell you straight up that they pull the money out of nothing. Another great person and quote from history, and I say great in quotations here, is the infamous Nathan Rothschild. So again, you get a little tidbit into their mindset. I care not what puppet is placed upon the throne of England to rule the empire on which the sun never sets. The man who controls Britain's money supply controls the British Empire, and I control the British money supply. So again, they tell you, if you have the ears to listen, you can see the egos are extremely high and they basically manipulate the system at their will. So another great quote is from Benjamin Franklin, and you can kind of start to see history may have been pushed and pulled in the direction it was based on different facts. So in the terms of the revolution in America, Benjamin Franklin is quoted as saying, "The refusal of the King George III to allow the colonies to operate an honest money system which freed the ordinary man from the clutches of the money manipulators was probably the prime cause of the revolution." So this is huge. Again, direct quotes from the founding fathers warning individuals, trying to tell people that here's the real issue. Here's what's causing all of our grief. So that being said, though, still a central bank established in America after the Revolution. So you can see here not long after the Revolution, mainly through the effort of Alexander Hamilton, who is an argued Rothschild sympathizer from some of the material that I've read, the first Bank of the United States was put in place in 1791. But now it's important to know that this bank was issued with a charter and it came out with a 20-year term. So at the end of 20 years, it came up for renewal. And you can see here the 20-year charter for the first Bank of the United States was up for renewal in 1811, and Congress decided not to, which they should have. But here we go. Let's pull and listen to Nathan Rothschild. Quote, "Either the application for renewal of the charter is granted or the United States will find itself involved in a most disastrous war." So Rothschild doesn't get his way. He doesn't get his central bank renewed. So what does he do? He causes chaos and disaster. The financed by the Rothschild controlled Central Bank of England, Britain took the U.S. to war. Even though it appeared the U.S. won, Congress was forced to grant a new charter which created the Second Bank of the United States. 20-year charter comes with this new central bank as well. It creates chaos and havoc all over the United States. Here comes in President Jackson, who won his second presidency on the slogan, "Jackson and no bank." He is quoted to say to the Bank of the United States, "You are a den of vipers and thieves, and I have determined to rout you out, and by the eternal God, I will rout you out." So shortly after successfully paying off the national debt and ending the Second Bank of the United States, there was an assassination attempt on Jackson by Richard Lawrence. Thankfully, though, Lawrence had both of his pistols misfire. Jackson was able to escape with his life and continue on the battle with the banking elite. But you can kind of see, and I'll get into this in further episodes, a theme developing here anytime you challenge these central banks. So from 1832 to 1913, there's no central bank, but we still have the banks with the ability of fractional reserve banking, and they wreak havoc. They expand and contract the money supply at will, causing all these ruckuses and chaoses, and they finally do a really big job in 1907. So moving to the next slide, the sleight of hand and the great trick. So after years of the banks manipulating the money supply, trust was finally destroyed by creating the great crash of 1907. Afterwards, the bankers got together on Jekyll Island in 1910, which referring back to the great book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, written by Edward G. Gifford, to devise a plan to put in place the third and current central bank called the Federal Reserve, which is not federal and it has no reserves. They specifically chose that name because the other names were too affiliated with a central bank, and so they chose this to make people believe that it was a political government entity. Here we go. Specifically, I want to bring a point to this. In 1913, on December 23rd, while all opposition was away on holidays, the elite voted in the Central Bank Act, which the income tax also came along with. So to sum this up, it does a great job. The Federal Reserve, if you don't understand how it works, start with Rule 11 in the Monopoly board game. Rule 11, what if the bank runs out of money? Some players think the bank is bankrupt if it runs out of money. The bank never goes bankrupt. To continue playing, use slips of paper to keep track of each player's banking transactions until the bank has enough paper to operate again. The banker may also issue new money on slips of ordinary paper. Does a great job explaining just exactly how this shell game and this Ponzi scheme works. It's so hilarious, but again, just refer to Rule 11 if you forget about how central banks work. Now we're going to transition into the last main topic, which is the world's reserve currency status, which right now that privilege goes to the US, which we'll go into in a minute here of the why and how that exactly happened. But first, let's look back to history of the other world reserve currencies and who they belong to and how long they lasted for. So you can see here, Portugal in 1450 to 1530, they had that privilege for 80 years. And then it jumped to Spain from 1530 to 1640. Then it went to the Netherlands for 80 years. And then it went to France for 95 years. Then Britain with the pound sterling for 105 years. And then pretty much it started around World War I. After that, the pound sterling went down, but it was really cemented for the US as an example after World War II. This chart says 1921, but I'll explain just here in a second of why I'm saying specifically after World War II. But regardless, you can see here along the chart that other nations have had the privilege of having the world reserve currency, and a thing to really pay attention to is they didn't have it forever. It would transition into belonging to someone else. So why does the US have this status? Well, after World War II in 1945 in New Hampshire at a Bretton Woods hotel, they sparked together what's called the Bretton Woods Agreement. And that is an agreement under which gold was the basis for the US dollar and other currencies were pegged to the US dollar's value. So before this and before World War II, other nations' currencies were linked to gold. But during World War II, a large portion of Europe and other countries, they shipped their gold to the US for protection. And afterwards, the US, having all that gold, everyone deemed the US dollar to be as good as gold. So in that moment in 1945, you have that connection and creation of the world's reserve status given to the US dollar. So in speaking of the Bretton Woods Conference, we're going to bring up this gentleman here, and his name is John Maynard Keynes. Now, this is talking and going back to fractional reserve banking, but I want to bring this up because he was basically the ringleader of this conference, and the Bretton Woods Agreement was pretty much his brainchild. So I just want to get into and show his thought process and how he really thinks. So by the means of fractional reserve banking, the government may secretly and unobserved confiscate the wealth of the people, and not one man in a million will detect the theft. So this is so important to understand, because here again you have someone that's in charge of these institutions, that's in charge of making these policies, and this is what they know and this is how they think. They know from the get-go that they're conning us and that we will not understand what's going on. So it's so important to know this. Keep this in your mind moving forward, because this is a really infamous quote. Now, moving forward a very short period of time, we only make it to 1971. You have Richard Nixon come out on August 15th and make his famous address where he severs the tie of the US dollar from gold. Now, you may ask, why did he do this? Well, other countries, specifically France, with its president de Gaulle at the time, they understood and they recognized that the US, between the Vietnamese War, the Korean War, and we'll say Lyndon Johnson's bread and butter campaign, that they knew that there was way more printed dollars in circulation than the gold backing it up. So countries had the right at that time, not individuals, but countries had the right at that time to redeem their gold using their dollar receipts. So de Gaulle and other nations withdraw their gold that they had stored in the US, and by a point of going from 20,000 tons, I believe, down to 8,000 tons, the Americans panic, and Nixon comes out and makes this severance of the tie between the US dollar and gold. And for now, the first time in history, you have these floating exchange rates between currencies. There's now no more anchor, and the governments are pretty much able to print at will. Now, this causes a lot of chaos from 71 to around 73, 74. Well, and actually going further, but 73, 74, there's a very significant thing that happened, and we have this gentleman here on the left. His name is Henry Kissinger, and this gentleman, being Nixon on the right, they went and talked to the Saudi Arabian, I believe, Crown Prince at the time, about sparking up a new deal, and that was where the petrodollar was born. So you have the U.S. providing and granting military protection with Saudi Arabia, as long as Saudi Arabia and OPEC bought and sold all all oil transactions in US dollars. So this is what really kind of cements, again, the reserve status for the US dollar, moving from around 73, 74 up into this modern day. So why do I bring that up, and why is that so significant now to understand the money system and the things happening geopolitically around the world? Well, the reason I bring it up because it's so important, because there's been some big death blows that have happened to the US dollar's petro status, so specifically the petro status. So China aims to challenge Brent WTI oil crude futures launch. So the launch of China's yuan denominated oil futures will mark the culmination of a decade-long push by the Shanghai Futures Exchange aimed at giving the world's largest energy consumer more power in pricing crude sold in Asia. So this is huge, because up until this point, all oil contracts were sold and bought in US dollars. Well, now you have China trying to sidestep that program and use the yuan to settle these contracts. And if you want to look at it as the second punch of a 1-2 punch blow to the US dollar petro status, here in the summer of 2001, right after Afghanistan was basically made a debacle because the US pulled out prematurely and it caused a lot of chaos, Saudi Arabia looked at that and made note of it, and shortly after they made an agreement. So Saudi Arabia and Russia have signed a military cooperation agreement at an arms expo outside of Moscow. Saudi Arabia Deputy Defense Minister Khalid bin Salman announced on Twitter, aimed at developing joint military cooperation between the two countries. So again, this is really significant because Saudi up until this point has been relying on the Americans for protection, but now we have another agreement with Russia asking what I can only assume is for protection. They just basically describe as a military pact, so you have to extrapolate from there. But when you look at it in terms of the US dollar reserve status, this is a big move. So moving on that same topic, you have what's called the BRICS nations, which Russia and China are involved with. Now, BRICS is just a term, and I believe BRICS specifically was coined around 2001 by Goldman Sachs executive named O'Neill. And then 2006, I believe South Africa is put into this mix, making the BRICS. So it's Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. This is a big deal because this group of countries is now becoming a major part of the world's GDP, and they're having more and more leverage. And what they're starting to do is they're starting to make contracts, bi and trilateral contracts between each other for commodities and other goods using their own currencies, or even sometimes, I believe Russia, they linked their ruble to gold. They're bypassing the US dollar system, and they're basically making trade amongst themselves. So this is very significant because here in us in the West, we will be affected by this within, let's say it's a year or 5 years or whenever it is. This is the next change. So going back to that reserve currency chart where we saw Portugal and Spain and France and all those countries have it, I believe the US dollar is at the end of its era, and now we're going to switch into something, whether it's controlled by a single country or whether it's controlled by a basket of countries. I believe the world reserve currency status is going to be shifting and moving. So we need to be aware of that, and we need to start preparing. So that being said, that's it. That's the brief history that I have as far as fractional reserve banking, central reserve banking, and the US dollar being the world reserve currency status for now. These are the topics I'm going to be going more into in detail later on with other episodes and in this channel just moving forward in the future. So if you like these topics and you like what I have to say, please be sure to like, share, subscribe, get this out there, help me grow the channel. Be sure to also follow me on Twitter. I'll put that link below again on the screen in the video. And just want to say again, thanks so much for being here, for checking me out on my new channel, and I can't wait to see you next time.